Hello and welcome to today's presentation, Cutting Through the Noise, Separating Fact from Fiction when Choosing the Right Disinfectant. Today's webinar is being presented by Virox Technologies, makers of PeroxyGuard disinfectants formulated with accelerated hydrogen peroxide, and Lighthouse Life Sciences. You will have the opportunity to submit your questions in the chat section located on the right-hand side of your screen. Send in your questions at any time throughout the presentation. Our team will be standing by to collect them for the live Q&A, which will be happening at the end of this presentation. So without any further ado, let's get started. Our original presenter couldn't join us today. However, today's webinar will be presented by another one of our in-house infection prevention and biosecurity experts here at Virox, Matthew Buccioni. So over to you, Matt.
Well, thanks, Lara, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining in today. So today I want to talk about how we can break through some of these myths and misconceptions surrounding cleaning and disinfection. And really from there, how we can go about choosing the right disinfectant product and the right disinfectant protocol to ensure that we're protecting both people and animals from the spread of infection. So as professionals who are working in the lab animal or the life sciences industry, I'm guessing that a lot of you are probably already very familiar with a lot of the key concepts around infection prevention. Because for you, infection prevention really is business as usual. I think what's really interesting around COVID is seeing this giant spotlight being placed on infection prevention, not only in life sciences, or even healthcare, but really all across so many different industries and really in the wider world in general. And a side effect of this is that we've seen information related to infection prevention spreading at a rate really unlike anything we've ever seen before. And with that, with all that information out there, it can be easy for myths to really spread just as fast as facts do. And so cleaning and disinfection, really our focus for today, has definitely been caught up in this trend. And whether we're talking about headlines, whether we're talking about social media, whether we're talking about marketing claims that might be out there, there's a lot of information to sift through. And so I think it really will help us to step back and think about some of those basic concepts and ideas around cleaning and disinfection to really cut through the smoke and mirrors and figure out the best way to both select a disinfectant and to use our disinfectant. So before we really delve into what these myths are out there, I want to just kind of set the stage by talking about why cleaning and disinfection is so important. And so really what it all comes down to is we know that pathogens can survive on surfaces. We know that when people and animals come into contact with these contaminated surfaces, that this can result in the spread of infection. And we know that outbreaks can happen as a result of that. So cleaning and disinfection really is our first line of defense against the spread of infection. So our first myth is all about safety. And so a couple common misconceptions that are out there about safety when it comes to cleaning and disinfection is, first of all, that disinfectants can be used in the same way to kill pathogens safely. And this might mean using the same personal protective equipment or applying the disinfectant in the same way. Another myth might be that disinfectant chemistries are really equal when it comes to their safety profile. And so we're going to go over a couple examples to really illustrate why that may not necessarily be the case. So during the COVID pandemic, unfortunately, we did see a spike in calls to poison control centers as a result of exposure to cleaning and disinfectant products. And there may be a few reasons for this. One main one may be instances of label instructions not being followed properly in terms of applying the disinfectant. Another reason may be not wearing proper personal protective equipment or PPE. And in some cases, potentially mixing chemicals in a way that could lead to potentially harmful reactions. And so really the two things that we always recommend looking at when trying to make sure that we're using disinfectant safely is to first consult the product label and the SDS as really the gold standard. So the product label is going to have the use instructions on how to use the product safely, and the SDS will really let you know about any particular hazards to look out for when using the product. So section 2 in particular of the SDS goes over physical and health hazards. So physical hazards might be flammability, it might be a way the product needs to be stored, If we're talking about health hazards, this could be acute toxicity profile, things such as skin and eye irritation, and other potential factors to watch out for. Also, we recommend being aware if there's any other specific safety concerns with the disinfectant that you're using. And we'll look at an example of this on the next slide. So this infographic here really just shows some of the consequences that can result from unsafe exposure to a disinfectant. And it really is quite a range. So we can be looking at neurological issues like headaches and dizziness. Certainly eye and skin irritation can be a concern, and then respiratory irritation as well. And from my point earlier about identifying particular concerns, an example of this is quaternary ammonium compounds and sodium hypochlorite in particular are two active ingredients that have been associated with occupational asthma. And so really just being aware of what those potential concerns are when evaluating a disinfectant is really that first step in ensuring that it's going to be used safely. And as we're seeing this increased use of disinfectants in a lot of different areas around the pandemic, it's that much more important to make sure that we're trying to choose the safest products that we can and taking all the steps to make sure that we're using the product in a safe way. And so just to sum up our facts around safety, so we know that improper disinfection can result in serious health issues. In particular, certain chemistries have been associated with occupational asthma, and that the disinfectant label and the SDS are really our key resources to be consulting for safe use. So our second myth is really all about the terminology that gets thrown around a lot around cleaning, disinfection, and sterilization. So we may hear cleaning, disinfecting, sanitizing used interchangeably, even sterilizing, but these are all actually referring to processes that are quite different. And something that you also might see is products that claim to kill 99.9% of pathogens. And this is what we call a 3-log reduction. And it sounds like a lot, 99.9 sounds like a lot, but this may not meet the needs for disinfection. Usually for disinfection, we need a higher level of kill than just the 99.9%. And so because these terms get confused, often it can be tempting to think that sanitizing might be equivalent to disinfection and that it might be sufficient to prevent the spread of infection. And we'll look at why that's not the case. So here's just an illustration of the difference between these processes. So on the far left, we have a Petri plate that was taken from a surface that had been cleaned, but not disinfected or sanitized. In the middle one is a surface that had been sanitized, but it hadn't been disinfected. So you can see in these two examples, there's still, on the microbial level, there's still quite a bit of contamination on the surface. But when we move over to the disinfection level on the far right, that's where you're seeing that much greater reduction in microbial load on the surface. So it really is quite a significant difference. So just some terminology. So when we're talking about cleaning a surface, we're talking about the process of physically removing dirt and debris from that surface. So we might be removing pathogens from the surface, but we're not necessarily going to be killing them. The one thing I will say about cleaning is that cleaning is a really important step in order for disinfection to work properly. And the reason for this is because removing those soils will really help the disinfectant be able to target pathogens effectively. If there's a significant amount of soils or bioburden on the surface, that can actually shield pathogens from the disinfectant, and the disinfection process might not be successful. When we're talking about sanitizing, this is really the process of reducing the quantity of vegetative bacteria, so bacteria that's not capable of forming spores, on a surface to levels that are considered safe. So an important distinction here with sanitizing is that we're only referring to certain types of bacteria, and we're not targeting other pathogens like viruses or fungi that might also be significant. That's really where disinfection comes in. So disinfection also kills bacteria, but to a greater level, and we're also going to be targeting other microorganisms like viruses and fungi as well. And when we talk about sterilization, this means that we're going to kill all microbial life, so everything on that surface. And a common example of where we might see this being done is autoclaving certain materials, using heat and steam to make sure that everything's getting killed. So just to sum this up again, we know those terms are quite separate and not interchangeable. Cleaning and sanitizing may not be sufficient to prevent infections in lab animal environments, and really cleaning and disinfection need to work together in order to prevent the spread of infection. So the next myth is a big one, and this is one that we may see a lot, and this is that disinfectants kill on contact. So I don't know if any of you have seen a surface being sprayed and then immediately wiped dry after the disinfectant's applied. And if this process is being followed, chances are organisms are not going to be properly killed on that surface. And the reason for that is because all disinfectants are going to have what's known as a contact time. And this contact time is a time that the length of time that the disinfectant needs to remain wet on the surface in order to be fully effective against pathogens. And so, as we can see, the contact times vary depending on what disinfection that you're using, but we need to make sure that the surface is not drying before that contact time is being achieved. So this study looked at the difference between the contact time and the drying time, so how fast does the product dry, comparing a few different types of disinfectant chemistries. And if you can see that the blue bar is significantly higher than the red bar, what that's telling us is that the disinfectant is going to need to be reapplied in order to be fully effective. And so just a quick video to really show what dry time versus contact time looks like. So I'm going to draw your attention in particular to product B, and that's the product on the right. So product B is a product with a 3-minute contact time. And I just want you to pay attention to the speed at which the product is drying on the surface. So as you can see, it's drying quite a bit faster than product A, and you can tell that if we're going to meet this 3-minute contact time, we may need multiple applications in order to ensure efficacy. And just further proof, so we're looking at another study that was done comparing a product with a 1-minute contact time and a product with a 10-minute contact time. So on the left, you can see a single application with a 1-minute contact time. We're seeing a significant reduction in microbial contamination. But on the right, we see a single application with a product that has a 10-minute contact time and quite a bit more contamination. So this is really showing us why choosing a product with a shorter contact time can really help overcome this issue. So just to sum it up, we know that contact time is really the length of time that the disinfectant needs to stay wet on the surface, and if it evaporates before that, the reapplication might be necessary. And choosing a product with a shorter contact time can help us overcome this. So the next myth really focuses on something that we like to call the claims game. And what we mean by the claims game is that a lot of disinfectant manufacturers will like to stack the product label with a really long list of efficacy claims. And that might give the impression that the product is very effective. But the problem with this is that a lot of those claims might be a lot of easier to kill organisms, and it might not reflect whether or not the disinfectant can kill harder to kill organisms as well. And so if you're comparing two disinfectants that both have a long list of claims, it might be tempting to think that those products are going to be equally effective, but we'll look at how to really evaluate efficacy claims and determine how effective the product is going to be. So our tool that helps us to do this is the hierarchy of susceptibility. And here is really this pyramid, this hierarchy of how susceptible certain categories of pathogens are to disinfection. So at the bottom here, we have our envelope viruses, and these are our easiest category of pathogen to kill. So examples might be influenza virus, certain bloodborne pathogens like Hep B and C, coronaviruses would also fall into this category. Moving up, we have our vegetative bacteria, so bacteria that are not going to form spores and become more resistant because of that. I'll draw your attention to the non-envelope viruses. So those are our harder to kill viruses. Examples you might be familiar with could be parvoviruses, murine norovirus, poliovirus is another example as well. And so we want to look for disinfectants that have claims against those harder to kill viruses rather than just the easier to kill ones. Mycobacteria, you'll see, is on top of that, and that's also known as, if a product has a claim against mycobacteria, that's also known as a tuberculocidal claim. So if a product has that claim against mycobacteria, it's considered to be tuberculocidal, also known as an intermediate level disinfectant. And then at the very top, we have bacterial spores, or spore-forming bacteria, and these are generally considered to be the most resistant category of microorganism to disinfection. So really, we want to look for that broad spectrum of efficacy rather than just a long list of certain types of claims. So I'm just going to tie together a few of the criteria that we went over so far using some common examples that you might see in the life sciences industry. So we talked about cleaning capabilities and why cleaning is so important for disinfection. And an important thing I want to point out here is that some disinfectants have detergents or surfactants built into their formulation. And as a result of that, they can be used as one-step cleaner disinfectants. For chemistries that don't have those surfactants or those detergents built in, there may need to be a pre-cleaning step with a separate detergent product before the disinfectant is used in order for it to be effective. So that's just really where cleaning capabilities tie in. We also talked about efficacy and contact time. And one point I wanted to make here is that both these things may be really dependent on the concentration of the disinfectant being used. So sometimes a product, a higher concentration of a disinfectant might either have a shorter contact time or it might have a broader spectrum of efficacy based on that. And just to give one quick example, so for instance, chlorine oxides may have a longer contact time for sporicidal efficacy compared to what would be required for bactericidal, virucidal efficacy. So just to recap, we want to look for a disinfectant with a broad spectrum of claims against relevant pathogens. So this can also include if there's any specific bioexclusion lists that you'd be concerned about, making sure that those pathogens are accounted for. And we also want to look for a product that's going to have a short contact time and strong detergency properties to help it be effective in real-world settings. So we're going to shift gears now and move away from focusing on the disinfectant product to now talking a little bit more about the protocol side. And so some myths that we want to debunk about the protocol is, first of all, on how the disinfectant is being applied, so that spraying the product on the surface may not be the most effective way. We're going to look at the myth that all substrates are necessarily going to be equivalent and why that's not the case. And also, we're going to look at the environmental aspect as well and what some things are that you might want to consider with that. So here's an image of a comparison between two different application methods. And on the left, we see a surface that had been sprayed with a disinfectant with a spray bottle. And on the right, we see a plate taken from a surface that had been wiped with a pre-moistened wipe substrate. And you can see that the pre-moistened wipe substrate really resulted in a much greater reduction in the microbial load on that surface. And the reason for this is because when disinfectant is being sprayed, if you think about where those droplets are landing and how that surface is being covered, there are definitely going to be spots that are going to get missed just because that spray is not going to cover the surface as evenly. Whereas using a wipe really helps ensure that even coverage and that spots are not going to get missed in the same way. So not only the application method, but also the actual substrate or the cleaning material that's used for wiping can also make a difference in the effectiveness of disinfection. So what this image is showing is the difference between different disinfectants and how the difference in different substrates and different materials in terms of how evenly they're releasing the disinfectant onto the surface. So at the top, we see the melt-blown polypropylene substrate, and that's going to be used in our pre-moistened wipes. Is really releasing that liquid pretty evenly along the surface. Whereas the cotton terry cloth at the bottom, you can see that it's releasing a lot of liquid initially, but then by the time it gets to the end of the surface, to the right, it's not keeping that surface wet. So more even release less even release, more initially and less later on. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is how the substrate is actually releasing that liquid across the surface. Another example that's not included on this is paper towel. So paper towel is an example of a substrate that may absorb liquid and may not necessarily release it as evenly across the surface. So another thing to keep in mind when we're talking about different wipe materials is if there's any interaction between the chemical being used and the cleaning material, the cleaning substrate. And probably the most common example of this is the phenomenon of clot binding. And so a certain type of disinfectant chemistry called a quaternary ammonium compound has this tendency to bind to certain cleaning materials, and particularly cotton. And what this does is this makes the active ingredient unavailable to disinfect properly. So it effectively inactivates the disinfectant. So we definitely want to make sure that we're understanding any potential interactions that like this that might be present. So there's a common perception is that a pre-moistened wipe substrate is automatically going to be worse from an environmental standpoint. And I think when you consider the sort of the overall life cycle of the product, it ends up being a trade-off between different factors. So when we're dealing with reusable cloths, there's the manufacturing of the cloths and the water and the energy required for laundering. In particular, this is done by a third-party service. And with a pre-moistened wipe substrates, we may be disposing them more frequently. I think an interesting advantage of a pre-moistened wipe substrate is that it could potentially help you prevent overusing the chemical because it comes pre-dispensed with the right amount of chemical. And so for that reason, it may help overuse chemical in a way that might be possible with a reusable cloth substrate. So just to sum up the discussion on the process. So really wiping the surface with either a pre-saturated wipe or a cloth is really going to be more effective than just spraying the surface. And not all wipe substrates are necessarily going to perform equally well. And they may need to be paired with the right disinfectant to ensure efficacy. So that might mean working with your disinfectant manufacturer to really figure out if there are any concerns with particular substrates. And they'll probably have a recommendation on substrates that they recommend that would pair well with the disinfectant. So the last main area that I want to get into with myths and facts is really on how to monitor and how to evaluate the cleaning and disinfection protocol. And we're really going to focus on ATP testing as the main way. So ATP testing is becoming popular in a variety of different industries, including food service and healthcare. And so what we really want to talk about is the fact that ATP is not necessarily going to be a direct correlation to the actual bioburden or the microbial load on the surface. And also another important factor is that ATP may not be reliable if we're trying to compare different disinfectant chemistries or if we're switching from one disinfectant chemistry to a different one. So because we can't directly see microbial contamination on the surface, we rely on a variety of different methods to try to assess whether or not cleaning and disinfection is being done properly. And so we'll get into some of the pros and cons of each one. So what this image is showing is a fluorescent marking system. And so what this involves is putting a fluorescent marker or like a fluorescent dye or a paint on a surface, which is invisible unless you shine UV light on it. And what this is often done for is for training purposes when you're trying to train teams on how to clean effectively and also provide feedback and validation on the cleaning process. So basically, by applying that before the cleaning process, you can shine a light on it after cleaning, and based on how much of that marker is left on the surface, that'll give you a sense of the thoroughness of the cleaning and disinfection process. So this is not directly looking at microbial contamination, but it is a good tool for training purposes if you're looking to actually evaluate the process itself. So getting closer to trying to detect actual contamination on a surface, The first one we're going to go over is ATP testing. So ATP testing, or adenosine triphosphate testing, is a system that's used to detect the presence of ATP on a surface. And this ATP may be from microbial contamination, but it can also be from other sources. It could be from body fluids or potentially food particles, or really other sources of organic contamination. So it really is a snapshot of the overall cleanliness of a surface, rather than a direct indication of the presence of pathogenic microorganisms. And something to keep in mind with ATP is that really when we're dealing with ATP and using different disinfecting chemistries, the results that you get may not be equivalent, because we understand that different disinfecting chemistries can affect an ATP meter in different ways. For example, one disinfectant may have a quenching effect on an ATP meter, so it can maybe lower the readings, whereas a different disinfectant can have the opposite effect. You could enhance the readings. And so for that reason, our recommendation is to always, whenever you're switching to a new disinfectant, to set a new baseline using ATP, rather than trying to use values that were in place already from a previous product. And it's also for that reason that comparing disinfectants, different disinfectants using ATP, might not give you results that are particularly useful. This is just a paper that was done looking at, from one of the manufacturers, looking at some of the differences between the meters, just to kind of illustrate that. So another technique I'll talk about is PCR. So PCR, polymerase chain reaction, what we're going to do with that is, this can be used to detect the presence of genetic material from different pathogens or different microorganisms on a surface. But the downside is that we're not going to be able to tell whether those pathogens are viable, or whether it's just inactivated material on a surface. For instance, if we disinfect a surface that has virus on it, and that virus it's destroyed, it's no longer going to be infectious, we could still get a positive PCR result just from that residual DNA or RNA on the surface. And so we always kind of recommend that we proceed with caution in interpreting PCR results for disinfection validation. So this is an interesting study that was kind of done to show this point. So this looked at PCR values of a surface that had been disinfected, and kind of what that looked like. And it showed that viral RNA or DNA was detected with all the disinfectants that were tested, despite the fact that there was actually no viable virus left on the surface. And you can see there is quite a difference between the different disinfectants in terms of the effects that they had on PCR values, which is interesting. And so just to sum up our points on validation, so we know that UV fluorescent markers and ATP can provide immediate visual and qualitative feedback to help us on the spot determine the effectiveness of the cleaning disinfection protocol. PCR can be helpful potentially for detecting DNA or RNA from a pathogen on a surface, but that we're not going to necessarily be able to tell whether or not that material is inactivated or infectious. And so I wanted to close off by just doing a bit of a summary and tying in some commonly used chemistries for some of the criteria that we discussed so far. So we want to look at, when evaluating a disinfectant, the cleaning capabilities of the product, the efficacy profile, and the contact time, and how those two things are related to one another. Safety profile, whether we're looking at skin irritation, eye irritation, and consulting the product label and the safety data sheet to do some research on that. And then what is that protocol that we should be using, whether it's pairing it with the right substrate or applying it in a way that is going to make it as effective as it can be. And so back to really our earlier statement about disinfection being the first line of defense. Really, cleaning and disinfection is a primary form of preventing the spread of infection, and making sure that we're doing it as well as we can, while also protecting the safety and the safety of animals is really a powerful tool to help us fight infection, both during a pandemic and, of course, during everyday use. So with that, I will end and open it up to questions if there are any. So thank you again for joining in.
Thanks, Matt, for a great presentation. That was very, very informative. And we did have a few questions come in. So our first question is, do you need to rotate disinfectants?
Yeah, and so that's a great question, and it really does depend on the disinfectant being used. For instance, some disinfectants might recommend a rotation step based on concerns about antimicrobial resistance that could potentially develop over time. Other disinfectants may not recommend a rotation step because that's not a concern for them. So just as an example, accelerated hydrogen peroxide products don't require a rotation step. But there may be some that do. So that's a conversation that can be had with the manufacturer to just determine whether or not that might be necessary.
That's great advice. And our next question is, how often do you recommend using ATP and or PCR?
That's a really good question. So for PCR, I wouldn't necessarily have a routine program of using PCR to monitor cleaning and disinfection. Really, I think where PCR might come in handy is if you wanted to confirm whether or not a particular organism is present on a surface. So if you think that you may have an outbreak of a particular organism and want to confirm, PCR may be useful to do that. But I wouldn't say that PCR could ever really be relied upon to monitor cleaning and disinfection. In terms of the frequency of an ATP program, we really don't have a set recommendation for that. Some facilities would do that on a regular basis, whether it's daily or whether it's from time to time, whether it's after every single application. So really, we really leave that at the discretion of every facility to figure out the best fit for them. But we're always happy to help if a facility ever wants help in kind of setting up a program in terms of how to set those baselines and then how to make sure that they're getting results that are the most meaningful to them.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Matt. It looks like that is the last of our questions that have come in. So thank you to you for the great presentation today. And thank you for everybody for attending today's webinar, Cutting Through the Noise, Separating Fact from Fiction when Choosing the Right Disinfectant. If you have any other questions, please visit proxyguard.com. You will also receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording of this webinar. So thank you again, and we hope to see you at our next webinar on April 14th, From Student to Master, Doing Your Homework to Choose the Right Disinfectant.